Hi everybody, welcome back to your virtual 207 lab. This week I'll be doing the PowerPoint. My name's Claire. I teach one of the sections. This is the first PowerPoint I've done for this. But yeah, okay, so let's get started. This week we're talking about the nervous system again. So last week we talked about the brain and cranial nerves, and Ryan did a really cool dissection that hopefully all of you watched because very cool. But this week we're talking about nervous system 2 information, which includes the spinal cord and spinal nerves. So as you know, the nervous system is divided into two main divisions. We have our central nervous system, which is the brain, which hopefully you know is this, and then the spinal cord, right, that extends down through the middle of your vertebrae. And then our peripheral nervous system is our cranial nerves that extend from our brain and go to our face, mostly areas in our head, and then spinal nerves, which extend from our spinal cord and go to the periphery or appendages outside of our body. So we kind of divided the nervous system unit a little bit weird just for simplicity's sake. We didn't stick to the CNS and PNS. We kind of did half and half. So you should already know the brain and cranial nerves. So this week we're going to talk about the spinal cord and the spinal nerves. And talk also a little bit about reflexes, reflex arcs, and all that good stuff. So if you take the spinal cord, right, which is this mass of nervous tissue that extends again through the vertebrae, if you were to take that meaty little noodle out of your vertebrae, it would look kind of something like this. So, right, you have the dense middle part in this picture is the actual physical spinal cord itself, and then extending from the spinal cord, you have a number of these little noodle-looking things that are spinal nerves, right? So the spinal cord stays put in the vertebrae. The spinal nerves are important for taking information from the periphery, bring it to the CNS, and then taking information from the CNS and bringing it back out to the periphery. But if we were to take that spinal cord, so this meaty part in the middle, and do a transverse section, so remember transverse sections are parallel with the ground. So if we were to do transverse sections through it, it looks something kind of like this. So you can see that there is a differentiation between white matter and gray matter, just like there is in the brain. But in the spinal cord, gray matter is going to be deep. So this little butterfly looking shape in the middle is going to be our gray matter, and white matter is going to be superficial, so along the outside here. If you remember from last week, in the brain, that's flip-flopped. So in the brain, remember our corpus callosum that connects our hemispheres, the deepest part of our brain really, that is white matter. So more superficially, we're going to see gray matter. So it's flip-flopped. But if we're to take these transverse sections in different areas in the spinal cord, the way that white and gray matter looks, that butterfly, if you will, is going to look different depending on what level of the spinal cord you're at. So the structure is going to be a little bit different, but in general, it's always going to have that same general shape. And always, gray matter is going to be deep, and then the white matter is going to be superficial. Also, like the brain, covering our spinal cord, we have meninges. Remember, those are the protective membranes, 3 layers that cover and hold cerebrospinal fluid, things like that, around our brain and also in the spinal cord, all throughout that dorsal body cavity. So there's a few extra spaces that we need to know in the spinal cord compared to the brain. So we have, like in the brain, dura mater is the most superficial. It's the thickest layer, really helps to protect the nervous tissue. Outside of that, which this picture doesn't really show, but it would be between the bones of your vertebrae, right, and the dura mater, they have the epidural space. So it's a space filled with cerebrospinal fluid. That's just an extra cushion between the bone, the hard, rigid bone of your vertebrae, and then the dura mater. So you can't see this in that picture, but you have your epidural space, you have your dura mater. Deep to your dura mater, same as the brain, you have your arachnoid mater, right, which is really spider-looky like another layer of meninges. Next, you have your subarachnoid space, which again is just a little gap between your arachnoid and then the deepest layer, which is the pia mater. It's a gap between there, again, filled with that cerebrospinal fluid, which is made by the ependymal cells, filled with that fluid just to help circulate nutrients and keep a nice cushion on the spinal cord to help protect it. So meninges is similar to the brain, just a few extra little spaces that you are required to know. The spinal cord itself, there's a lot of different features that we're going to have to know. Normally I draw this on the board, so I am going to do my best to draw it on the computer and then just talk over it while I'm drawing. But here's just all of the ones that you have to know starred on an actual diagram. But I'm just going to actually go through and draw and write it out on a picture. So hold on. Okay, so here's me drawing that. This is an image of a cross section of a spinal cord. Like I said, a transverse section that would be parallel with the ground. So this is what it would kind of look like. And again, gray matter in the spinal cord is going to be deep. So all that gray stuff on the inside there would be our gray matter. And then in the spinal cord, white matter is going to be more superficial. So all the stuff on the outside is considered white matter. And remember, this is going to be reversed from the brain, flip-flopped. Okay, so in the spinal cord, the gray matter, that deep stuff, we can divide into different sections, and the names are based on just where the area we're talking about is located. So this back side is called the dorsal horn. On the edge, we have a lateral horn, and then up front is the ventral horn. So gray matter, again, always going to be deep, named just based on where it's at, and then dorsal, lateral, ventral, but always going to be called horns. Okay, white matter also similarly is all just going to be called funiculi or funiculi. So on the back side, we have the dorsal funiculus. On the lateral edges, again, lateral funiculus, pretty self-explanatory. And then the front is going to be called the ventral funiculus. Sorry, my dog is snoring very loudly right now. That would be Stella. I'll add an image of her. But yeah, so gray matter, horns, white matter, going to be called funiculi. And then again, just named based on where in the spinal cord it's at, dorsal, lateral, or ventral. So besides those main structures of the spinal cord, there's going to be also little structures that we have to know. So that little line on the back is actually a sulcus. So we learned about that last week when we talked about the brain. The sulcus is just a groove, right? So on the back, we have a posterior median sulcus. Posterior, it's on the back side. Median, it's in the middle. Sulcus, it's a little groove. Front, there's also a groove. This one's a lot deeper. So this one's called the anterior median fissure. So if you remember, a fissure is just a really deep sulcus. Anterior because on the front, again, median in the middle, fissure because it's deeper. And just looking at the picture, you can tell the sulcus versus the fissure. And then the last feature, in the very middle of the gray matter, though, you can see a little hole. That is called the central canal, and that is filled with cerebrospinal fluid, and again, just allowing nutrients to get to the spinal cord. Okay, so besides those main features, we have leaving the spinal cord, those two little noodle-looking guys. Those are going to be called roots, right? So we have one coming in the back side. That's going to be called the dorsal root. And then we have one leaving the front side in orange there. That would be the ventral root. We'll talk about what type of information these carry when we talk about the reflex arc. But those noodles leaving, dorsal root and ventral root. A really important structure that I just circled right there is how we know what side's dorsal, and that is called the dorsal root ganglion. You can see only the dorsal side, the dorsal root, has that little bulge in it. So we can always orient ourselves. If we see that bulge, we know it's the dorsal side, right? So these two roots, after they leave the spinal cord, eventually they're going to merge and create the spinal nerve. So the dorsal root comes out, right, and the ventral root comes out, extends, and eventually those two roots are going to merge and they're going to create the spinal nerve. And the spinal nerve is what we see leaving the spinal cord. So in those drawings, the little noodles leaving the big meaty thing, I kept saying the big meaty guy in the middle, those are the spinal nerves. Okay, so that's just the basic anatomy of the spinal cord. Next, we're going to talk about reflexes. All right, so this is Stella, the loud snoring that you may hear in the background, just so you all know who you're listening to snore like a psycho. Okay, we're talking about some reflexes now. So, everyone, I think, has probably heard of a reflex. At the doctor's office, you might have reflexes tested. So, for example, this is showing the patellar tendon reflex. So, at the doctor's office, they tap on your knee with this little hammer thing, and it causes your foot to move, right? I think everyone's at least somewhat familiar with this idea. So, this happens because of a reflex arc. So what's happening is basically when this hammer hits the patellar tendon, there are sensory receptors in the muscles that sense the change of stretch of the muscles, send information to the spinal cord. Spinal cord integrates the information and sends motor information back out and tells the muscles of your leg to contract or relax, causing a movement to happen, right? So for reflexes to happen, you don't need input to the brain necessarily. So most of the time you just have interneurons within the spinal cord, and we'll talk about these more in a second. Interneurons within the spinal cord integrating the information and sending information back out. So there's two types of reflexes you guys are going to see. So the first is autonomic or visceral reflexes. Think autonomic, automatic. These are automatic things that aren't subject to our conscious control. So things that we're not even thinking about doing that are just kind of happening. So activated by smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, and then also glands of the body. Regulating bodily functions that we don't think about, such as digestion, elimination, blood pressure, salivation, sweating, all of those things that are automatic, autonomic that we don't think about, still have to have, information being sent from the central nervous system. So those are going to be autonomic reflexes. We also have somatic reflexes, which is the stimulation of skeletal muscles by the somatic division of the nervous system. And examples of these reflexes is the rapid withdrawal of a hand from a hot object. So a little distinction there. Reflex tests are very important. This is a lot of text, I'm aware, but it's important because it's a good diagnostic tool for assessing conditions of the nervous system. So if we do a reflex test and we notice that the reflex isn't as pronounced as it should be, or maybe it's too exaggerated, maybe it's not there at all, that can tell you a lot about how well our nervous system is functioning. So if there's issues within the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system, any part of the nervous system at all, if there's issues with it, we'll be able to see it in some sort of reflex test. So it helps us kind of figure out if there are issues. It helps us diagnose, what the cause of those issues may be. If there's spinal cord injuries, reflex tests can pinpoint the area or level of the spinal cord injury. So anything above the injured area might not be affected, but below the lesion, you might not see proper reflex responses. So a lot of people who are paralyzed, right, don't have control over different parts of the body. We can determine where exactly the damage is in the spinal cord based on these different reflex tests. So there's a few different components of the reflex arc. Again, I'm going to draw it all out and show you, but here are them listed. So you can take a look, write that down in your notes if you want. But I'm going to go through and draw it and talk through it in my other program. So hold on 1 second. Okay, reflexes. So again, if you're looking at cross-section of the spinal cord, important to be able to differentiate between the dorsal and ventral side. So that dorsal root ganglion, remember, is how we know that that side is the dorsal side. So it's dorsal side back there, and then that would mean the other side would be the ventral side. So when we're talking about reflexes and information being carried, sensory and motor information is going to enter and leave the spinal cord on their own side. So sensory information is always going to enter the dorsal side of the spinal cord, so sensory or afferent. Motor or efferent information is going to always leave the spinal cord on the ventral side. So for reflex arc, we're going to start with some sort of sensory receptor out in the periphery. So it could be a thermoreceptor on the skin, could be muscle spindle fiber, looking at stretch, any sort of sensory receptor in the periphery. Leaving that sensory receptor, we're going to have the axon of the sensory neuron. Then we're going to have a cell body, or the soma. The cell body of the sensory neuron is housed in that dorsal root ganglion, right? So that dorsal root ganglion, the reason that there's a bulge there is because we have that cell body of the sensory neuron is there. So that's why there's a bulge. So there are sensory neurons, if you remember from last week, Ryan talking about the types of neurons. We have multipolar, bipolar, unipolar. So these primary sensory fibers are all going to be unipolar neurons, right? So you have the cell body with one offshoot, and then the axon coming off of that. So the dorsal root ganglion is really important because it houses the cell body of sensory neurons. Okay, so we have the axon coming in, again, that dorsal side. In this dorsal horn, remember the gray matter of the spinal cord, we're going to have the axon terminal of our sensory neuron. That will synapse onto a cell body of a interneuron. So we can see the cell body, the axon, and the axon terminal of the interneuron. And an interneuron is just within the CNS. Then we have our motor neuron on the ventral side. So our cell body is going to be in the ventral horn. Our axon is going to go out to the ventral root. And our axon terminal is going to be out in the periphery, and it's going to synapse onto some sort of effector, which could be a muscle, it could be a gland. An effector is anything that it's going to cause it to do something. So that's the basic setup for our reflex arc. So sensory information is going to come in that dorsal side, be integrated in the interneuron within the CNS, and then motor information is going to leave the ventral side. And it's always going to go that same way. So again, dorsal is always sensory, ventral is going to always be motor. So it's important you know that, but it's also important that you know where you can find the cell bodies and the axon terminals of these different types of neurons. So for sensory neurons, the axon is going to be in the dorsal root, right? Cell body is going to be in the dorsal root ganglion, and axon terminal is going to be in the dorsal horn. For motor neurons, cell body is going to be in the ventral horn, axon is going to be coming out the ventral root, and axon terminal is going to be out in the periphery at a neuromuscular junction, something synapsing onto the muscle. Okay, good. What else do I have? Oh, so remember we talked about the spinal nerve is where the dorsal and ventral root meet. This means the spinal nerve carries both sensory and motor information. right? Spinal nerves are always going to be mixed nerves. We talked about cranial nerves, sometimes are sensory, sometimes are motor, sometimes are both. Spinal nerves, 100% of the time, are mixed nerves. Okay, so that's the reflex arc. All right, so the last thing we're talking about this week are the actual spinal nerves themselves. So we talked about the spinal cord, different features of that, and the spinal reflex arc. So now we're talking about the spinal nerves, or the little spaghettis here that are leaving the spinal cord. So first of all, they can be named just based on where they're leaving the spinal cord. So we talked about the skeleton, we talked about the vertebrae. You know, you have cervical, thoracic, lumbar vertebrae, and then you have the sacrum, right? So depending on where the spinal nerves are leaving, between which vertebrae, they get their names based on that. So cervical nerves are leaving the spinal cord through the cervical vertebrae, thoracic through the thoracic vertebrae, so on and so forth. So that's the first thing. The other stuff, again, I'm going to draw and talk about. So we'll talk about this in a minute. And then each individual nerve here that's labeled, you're going to have to know. You also have to know which plexus it arises from. So again, we'll talk about that in a second. All right. So again, coming off the spinal cord, we have individual spinal nerves. So each of these little branches off is a single spinal nerve. This is a picture of the actual model that you would normally look at in class. I thought it'd be cool to draw on that. But there's 31 pairs of spinal nerves total. You also have 4 different plexuses you have to know. So when the spinal nerves leave the spinal cord, sometimes if there's a lot of nerves going to the same area, they're going to be grouped together just for, simplicity, I guess. It's more efficient for the body. So there's 4 plexuses you're going to have to know. From each plexus, there's certain nerves you have to know. So the first plexus up here by the neck is called the cervical plexus. So it's by the cervical vertebrae. So the cervical plexus, there's one nerve that comes from the cervical plexus you have to know. It's this little guy. It's kind of hard to see, that little nub right there. That is the phrenic nerve. Phrenic, writing it out, good. The phrenic nerve innervates the diaphragm. So actually this nerve is going to extend down all the way to the diaphragm, but in this model they just kind of cut it off for simplicity's sake. So first plexus is your cervical, contains, the only one you have to know is your phrenic nerve, innervates the diaphragm. The next plexus is the brachial plexus. So the brachial plexus contains all of the nerves that are going to go to your arm. So there's 4 nerves in this plexus you have to know. The first is this little guy here that I'm drawing on top of. This is your auxiliary nerve, which is going to innervate your armpit and shoulder region. So you can think like your deltoid, teres major muscles in that area are innervated by your auxiliary nerve. The other 3 are easy to see down here. So the first here is going to be your radial nerve. So remember, your radial bone is going to be the bone on the thumb side. So your radial nerve goes right over top of that. Your radial nerve innervates the forearm and hand muscles and skin, and is important in forearm and hand extension. In the middle of the arm, you have your median nerve. Again, these are all part of the brachial plexus. Your median nerve innervates the forearm and hand again, but this time is important in flexion. And these are just very overly simplified, but as much as you have to know. And then the last nerve you have to know in your brachial plexus is the ulnar, by the ulnar bone. And this is important in forearm flexion. So radial on the thumb side by your radius, median in the middle, and ulnar by your ulna on the pinky side. Okay, so that's your whole brachial plexus. Next plexus we're going to talk about is your lumbar plexus. So that guy right there, lumbar plexus, that has nerves that are going to your leg. The only one you have to know is that guy there that I'm highlighting. That is your femoral nerve. It goes right above your femur and it innervates your anterior leg. It's more specific than that, but that's as much as you're going to have to know. So a femoral nerve innervates your anterior leg. The last plexus is your sacral plexus by your sacrum. Sacral plexus, again, only one nerve you have to know. This is your sciatic nerve. If you see, it goes underneath this bone here, so it can get pinched really easy. A lot of times you have sciatic nerve pain. But your sciatic nerve from your sacral plexus innervates the posterior leg muscles. Okay. And then finally, the last thing I want to talk about, so we talked about the spinal cord. If you take a cross section through, it's that butterfly looking shape. The spinal cord actually doesn't extend all the way down through your vertebrae. So there's a true end of the spinal cord. That's called your conus medullaris. And it ends right there where the end of that white part is in the picture. Beneath that, inferior to that, instead of having a dense, meaty spinal cord, you actually have a whole bunch of spinal nerves hanging down. I like to think of them kind of like wet noodles. That's called your cauda equina, which translates to horse's tail. So the conus medullaris is the true end of your spinal cord at about L1 or L2. And then anything below that is your cauda equina. And what's actually really interesting, if you're going to do a spinal tap or something like that, they always do it in the lower back below L1 or L2. Because what they're doing is sticking a big needle into your spinal cord to get spinal fluid. If they stick the needle into a dense mass of neurons, nervous tissue, it's going to cause damage, which we don't want, right? Because nervous tissue does not heal very easily, doesn't make new neurons very easily. So when they stick the needle in, they stick it in the cauda equina area, because when you stick the needle in there, those little wet spaghettis just kind of move out of the way, and they can get their sample of cerebrospinal fluid without damaging any tissue. Okay, so on EduCat there is I'm just talking when this is ugly, but whatever. On EduCat there is a PDF that shows this diagram with all the things you have to know labeled on it. So I definitely use that as a study tool, a little reference. But that's it for this week. So if you have any questions, let me know. Oh, excuse me. If you have any questions, let me know. Next week, we're going to be talking about special senses. And I'm doing that PowerPoint as well. So if you hated this drawing stuff, just let me know and I'll never do it again. But otherwise, I will probably do more drawings. Okay, bye.